Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com. And tonight we're going to talk about the arrest of Julian Assange. Welcome to the reprehensibles. Welcome to the unauthorized, to the VFM, to the Dread Ilk, and to the Bears. So it's been a busy day today. Some of you noticed that the graphic for the Darkstream changed. It's because I was planning to primarily discuss Milo's new book, How to Be Poor. And we will discuss that a little bit, but I thought that it was important to address the major news of the day as well. So I know a lot of people wanted to talk about it and discuss it, so that's all cool. It's interesting because I had assumed pretty much from the start that Julian Assange was a good guy, that he was, like Edward Snowden, somebody who was primarily driven to oppose the surveillance state. And that may well be true. That may well be entirely true. But one thing that I thought was very interesting is that this all seems to be very closely timed to what was happening with regards to the Mueller report and some of the other developments that are happening with regards to the ongoing struggle between the deep state and those who appear to oppose it. And again, I say appear intentionally because the truth of the matter is those of us on the outside simply have no idea what's going on. There are certain things that we know about WikiLeaks that appear to be positive, but there's also other things about WikiLeaks and people like Snowden that are, where there's still some questions. And I think that's important to keep in mind before we excessively lionize the guy or assume that that we know what's going on, that we know what's up. And so if you look at, for example, somebody said, Dennis is presumably being sarcastic when he says, sure, controlled opposition locked in a room for 7 years. That does seem strange. Why would anyone who is controlled opposition do that? Unless, of course, you can be controlled opposition without realizing the part that you're playing. I always thought it was very strange that Assange ran away from the Swedish claims, the Swedish charges, no matter how ridiculous they were. I mean, the charges in Sweden were obviously ridiculous, obviously false. But if you know anything about the Scandinavian countries, you know that there is little to be concerned about. Anders Breivik murdered dozens of people, and he got sentenced to 21 years. For those who talk about how Assange looks like he's been in jail for the last 7 years and how he's been effectively imprisoned in a room for 7 years and so forth, why would you do that rather than get locked up at most for 6 months in a very comfortable Swedish prison. So the whole thing is I think very confusing. Shania, that's a really, really stupid question. I mean, that's such a stupid question. It raises the obvious question of, if you understood anything that I said, you going to keep buying into the character assassination of Assange? I don't buy into the character assassination of Assange. But I also don't buy into the assumption of sanctitude on his part. I think that there are reasonable questions that you can ask about the entire situation and most of the parties involved. If we believe that Trump is more or less on the side of the American people and more or less in opposition to the surveillance state, then why is he so adamantly opposed to Assange and Snowden and so forth? Maybe he just has it wrong. That's entirely possible. Donald Trump is probably the most misinformed man on the planet. Donald Trump does not have a perfectly reliable group of people around him giving him information. That's one possibility. Perhaps Assange is a good guy and the president is misinformed about him. I'm just pointing out that there's all kinds of different possibilities, I mean, we don't know. You don't know. That is also true, Randy. When he fled to the embassy, it was unlikely that he planned on being stuck there for 7 years. That's true. And why would you flee to the, okay, Shania, you're banned. Go away. I don't. So it's interesting to see the way that people absolutely assume that they know what's going on. There is no way that you have a full understanding of it. Robert Clemens says, yet you don't think Trump can just be a fraud? I think that is very unlikely. I think it is much more likely that if he has actually turned his back on his various campaign promises and so forth, then I think it is entirely possible that he got co-opted, that he grew in office, et cetera, et cetera. But there was no reason for him to run at all if that was the object. Ted Cruz and the others could have delivered everything that Trump has done and more. And the thing that I think it's very, very important to understand, I've been reading a history of the Peninsular War, which is the story, the one of the most detailed histories of a war that's ever been written. And when you look at the way that the various parties were operating, various parties who were nominally on the same side, and it didn't matter whether you looked at the French marshals and whether you looked at the Spanish generals or the English generals and diplomats. In every single circumstance, it was a huge exaggeration to say that they were working together or were on the same side. I mean, yes, they were more or less on the same, that they were more or less on the same side. You know, certainly the various French generals all had their assignments from Napoleon, and they all had the basic goal of winning the war against Spain and against Portugal. But when you look at what the various individuals each did, they were constantly pursuing actions and pursuing objectives that were directly contradictory to the people on their side. And the combination of those competing objectives had a significant effect on their ability to act together. And so to try to put all of these various actors into two camps, one, the good guys, all of whom are doing good things for good reasons, and the bad guys, all of whom are doing bad things for bad reasons, is so fundamentally simplistic and so absolutely certain to be wrong that it pains me to have to explain this. Now, I will say that when you see somebody like Ben Shapiro saying that Assange is a Russian front and WikiLeaks is evil, according to intelligence sources, which Shapiro does not have, then yes, I think that it's very normal and natural to react to that and assume that Assange must be a good guy and that WikiLeaks is doing the work of the angels. I'm not saying that that's false. If I had to bet, I would bet on Ben Shapiro being wrong, because that is a very, very safe bet. Because even when he's not just wrong, he's usually lying. So, if I were Julian Assange, I would have trusted Trump. I would have. You have to, at a certain point in time, you have to take leaps of faith. And even though you might have doubts in the individual, doubts in the individual's veracity, doubts in the individual's capability to truly understand the truth, at a certain time you have to take a leap of faith. Why anyone would decide to place their faith in the Ecuadorian ambassador to the UK, I do not understand. I mean, I genuinely don't understand that. And I don't blame anyone who says that they don't trust Trump any longer. I think that there are sufficient reasons that people can doubt whether Trump is going to live up to his campaign promises. He has lived up to a fair number of them, but unfortunately he does seem to be more interested in what's happening in Israel than what's happening in the United States. And so it's difficult to, as Q says, trust the plan. What plan? It doesn't look like there's a plan. Not now. On the other hand, it's very, very important to keep in mind that, like I said earlier, Donald Trump is probably the most misinformed individual on the planet. And he is in a situation that is one of the most difficult situations that any human being has ever been in on the planet. The degree of difficulty of what he is, if we believe in him, what he's attempting to do is incredibly difficult. No, I'm not talking about 5D chess. I don't believe in 5D chess. I am smarter than just about anybody involved in all this crap. And there is no way, there's no way that anyone is planning all of this. It doesn't work that way, okay? For example, if you look at, let's go back to that history of the Peninsular War. It's fascinating to read the takes of Wellington and Napoleon on the situation as it's involved. It is astonishing to read how successfully Wellington is able to understand the situation in all of Spain, despite the limitations of the communications technology then, and successfully anticipate what's going to happen and what other people are going to do. But even he makes massive blunders. And even Napoleon, who was incredibly perspicacious and a brilliant strategist, as well as a pretty good tactician, even he gets things completely wrong, reliably wrong, because he was too far removed from the situation. But what I found astounding was not that his orders were inevitably out of date and so forth. What I found astonishing was how much he grasped of the situation from nothing but letters that his marshals would send him. His ability to grasp all of it and to anticipate events and so forth. And yet, both of those brilliant guys, both of those proven military leaders who are among the best humanity has ever seen, both of them were totally unable to significantly plan events more than a month in advance. So the idea that Trump is engaged in some sort of 5D Xanados gambit it's not credible. I don't believe in that sort of thing. I don't think that anyone is even capable of that. Here's a good question. How can the U.S. try a foreign national for breaking U.S. law when the guy wasn't even in the U.S.? How can the U.S. demand extradition from a third country? It has to do with his involvement with the crimes committed by Bradley Manning. If you look at the indictment that they filed, it has to do with his involvement in a crime that took place in U.S. On U.S. soil, et cetera, his alleged involvement in it. So, the other thing that concerns me a little bit about the idea that the anti-surveillance state heroes are necessarily the good guys was the way that Vladimir Putin reacted to Edward Snowden. If Snowden was fully genuine, just this honest guy who believed the NSA was doing wrong and wanted to expose it for that reason, I would have thought that Putin would have had a lot more respect for him and would have treated him a lot better and would have utilized him in some way. And that just hasn't been the case at all. And so that's why, you wonder, just because Snowden wasn't a good NSA man, that doesn't mean that he wasn't, working for somebody else. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that it is a mistake to assume that just because somebody is the enemy of your enemy, that they are your friend. Think about how many of you thought that Jordan Peterson was a good guy because he stood up to SJWs. Okay? Think about how many of you thought that Ben Shapiro was a good guy because he was owning liberals on Twitter and standing up to the liberal college administrations. Do you still think that Shapiro and Peterson are good guys? Of course not. And so if somebody who does one thing that appears to be good can turn out to be so bad, then we have to at least be open to the possibility that there's something else going on with regards to Snowden and Assange. And the point is that it doesn't matter what we think anyhow. Nothing that you think about Assange, nothing that I think about Snowden is remotely relevant to what actually happened. We know nothing about what's actually happening. Harvey, then, let's have a conversation about, well, I think before we have a conversation about it, we should have a conversation about the type of conversation that we're going to consider having. Or maybe we should have a conversation about that conversation. But, I really think that just this conversation about that conversation about what sort of conversation we're going to have is really good. I mean, it really shows how much things have improved over the conversations of the past. That clip was hilarious. I very much enjoyed it. I haven't mentioned Seth Rich yet. It would be nice to know what happened to Seth Rich. It would be nice to know who is responsible. And certainly the fact that WikiLeaks released the Podesta emails and so forth does tend to lead one to believe that they are on the side of the good, the true, and the beautiful. But we don't know. So, I'm just trying to make sure that we all understand that, we're just very, very small fish that swim in a very, very big ocean. And we have no real understanding of what's going on with those giant blue whales or those pods of killer whales. We're just swimming around and we can theorize all we want. And we can have whatever theories we want, but we don't know. And I think that we should be open. Now, obviously, I think the Seth Rich thing was absolutely not a robbery. I mean, that obviously looked like some sort of hit that had something to do with the information that he had and had something to do with the DNC. But again, we don't know. We just don't know. And, I'm not trying to disabuse anyone of their perspective on WikiLeaks or on Assange and so forth. To the extent that I have a position, I tend to be pro WikiLeaks and pro Assange. But I'm not claiming to know for sure. I'm not claiming to know that the way that I lean is correct. I mean, at this point, I'm not entirely sure about what's going on with Donald Trump. And even if Trump is not going to live up to his campaign promises to build the wall and drain the swamp, there are a number of different reasons that could explain that range from, he's never intended to do any of those things from the start, to he's still planning to do so, but is just waiting for the right time to do it. Hard to say. Scott says, do you think Assange will commit suicide by shooting himself several times in the back of the head? No, because Hillary Clinton isn't president. Yeah, Thomas, that's right. That's why I am curious about the timing of this. Barr says there was spying during the election, and the next day Julian Assange is arrested. And I do think that this tends to be more likely. Jake D says, Assange was arrested and will be used as a means to inject important evidence into our legal system through his compelled testimony. He will not be martyred. I think that is more useful. I think that is a more likely possibility. But again, I'm not saying that that's the case. I don't know. I am, like you, operating in complete ignorance. So, but I am hopeful that that Assange will be used to provide more truth to the American people. I would hope so. Travis Moss says, another strange thing is that Trump didn't take care of the wall in his first 2 years when both chambers had GOP control. I don't think that's strange at all. The real problem, it's kind of like in the UK where you could say that, well, how come they haven't been able to push Brexit through when the Tories have control of the government? Well, it's because most of the MPs are Remainers. And so most of the Republicans were anti-wall. Most of the Republicans still are pro-immigration. They're not as uniformly pro-immigration as the Democrats, but they never supported the wall or the restrictions on immigration that Trump was pushing for from the beginning. In fact, John Derbyshire had an interesting and I think insightful column about the fundamental problem with the U.S. political system right now. He reviewed the immigration ratings of the Republican senators and congressmen, and their average grade on immigration was a C-. They're all over the place, from being a complete F to being quite strong on it, to being an A. But the Democrats are almost unilaterally Fs. They're almost unilaterally pro-immigration, pro-illegal immigration, anti-wall, anti-repatriation, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is no single build a wall, drain the swamp party. Both parties, or as I used to call them, the bifactional ruling party, are pro-immigration, pro-swamp parties. And that's why it's been so difficult for Trump to make any progress whatsoever, even if you operate under the assumption that he is absolutely trying to. Sammy Bandit asks, does the American system allow for party whips to make sure people are in line? Yeah, they do, but they're less effective than the British parliamentarian whips. Larry 5200 says population replacement is the goal of the liberals. That's true, but what you need to understand is that conservatives are not against population replacement. They may not be aggressively for it, but neither do they oppose it. There's nothing that conservatives like. They say it doesn't matter if someone is Mexican or Congolese or anything else, as long as they give lip service to the ideas of the proposition nation. But of course, as Owen Benjamin showed in his resort to the 1828 Webster Dictionary, the literal definition of American is someone living on the continent of North America who is of European descent. That, in 1828, that was the literal dictionary definition of American. And so, obviously that's been redefined. What people claim America to be now, nothing but an idea that anyone around the world can possess. You can be born American in Portugal. You can be, I think Muammar Gaddafi said that America is not limited to Americans. That's where you get once you start playing word wizardry. I mean, yeah, that, like Travis says, conservatives are progressives in slow motion. Yeah, they just stand there to get moved. So, Vox, do you think they really believe that, the conservatives, or do they just have to say it? Most of them really believe it. They really believe it because the alternative is too painful for them. It's easier for them to believe that I am evil and that the dictionary magically changed and the dirt is magic than it is to accept the fact that they knowingly gave up their country, that they knowingly betrayed their nation. That's a very, very difficult thing for your average conservative to accept. And so, and that's why the whole system is going to collapse. That's why the whole system is going to fail, because the nation wasn't defended when it needed to be. And so, the sooner that you recognize that and accept it, then the sooner that you can begin dealing with reality. But most people today throughout the West are living in a delusion bubble, and it's not entirely their fault. They were brainwashed as children, they were propagandized as young adults, and they are continually bombarded by a false narrative by the media. So it's very, very difficult to penetrate all of that wizardry, all of those false narratives, and see the truth. And if you don't read old books, if you don't look up definitions from 1828, you won't know what the truth is. You have no way of knowing it. Northwest Thebad says, why can't you just admit the truth about Assange, Vox? Because I don't know what the truth is, and neither do you. And if you think you know what the truth is, you're probably very stupid. There's a question here. I haven't addressed the super chats yet. I will do so very soon. Starasp says a lot of people believe it because the alternative is that a system that's been built over more than a century is going to lead to absolute failure. That's true. That's absolutely true. Yusuf Darwich, I don't do what about me questions. If you want to, here's what I will answer you. He asks, my father was a Syrian immigrant, but my mother's side has captains from both the Revolutionary and Civil War. Where do I belong? All right. So this is what a sociologist has to say to you and everybody in your position. I will recommend the paper to you. The paper is called Sleeping with the Enemy, an essay on mixed identity in the context of violent conflict. It's by Ralph Hartley at the University of Nebraska. When competition between groups becomes violent, the female of a mixed marriage and her offspring are often vulnerable to violence by not only the group from which her male partner is assigned, but also to violent acts by members of the group with which she is identified. When the goal of an adversary is to eliminate manifestations of identity, the role of the individual within a society, including children and other non-combatants, is of little consequence. Using the conflict in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda as a focus, this essay takes a biosocial and cultural comparative approach in exploring the situational factors underlying genocidal behavior, wherein the woman in a mixed conjugal union and her offspring are disproportionately vulnerable to violence. The possible co-evolvement of individual behaviors with group-level institutions is considered as worthy of more focused attention in an attempt to understand the intense vulnerability of some women and children in environments of lethal conflict. So, what does that mean? What does that have to do with you? Well, as that should tell you, and as I've always been telling people, you'll be accepted by who you'll be accepted by, and you'll be rejected who you'll be rejected by. And nothing that I say has any significance whatsoever. There's a reasonable chance that you'll be hated by both sides. Not your fault. You know, I'm sure if you're watching this, you're probably a intelligent person, more intelligent than the norm. You may well be a very lovely individual. But people don't care. The question is not, to which group do I actually belong? Because the answer may be none. So the answer is you will be accepted by those who choose to accept you. So, Rockley Marine is right. Change your name to Bob. There's a reason why people would change their names when they came to Ellis Island, because they wanted to try to fit in. When my wife's ancestors came over from Norway, they changed their name from a very Norwegian name to a very bland, common English name because they wanted to fit in. So, let's see. Tony Swan says, this is an interesting perspective because it's much more common than people realize. Tony Swan says, as a mixed race person, I hate race mixing more than anything else on earth. They should be RIP, and I accept that. Nobody understands the identity issues more than somebody who already experiences them. You see this all the time. You see these kids where you've got over here in Europe, you've got a European woman, usually not terribly attractive, although, every now and then there is one, gets involved with an African, and suddenly her entire social circle is now entirely made up of Africans and the very small number of European women involved with the Africans. But what's interesting to me is that the children of those mixed relationships, mixed marriages, are almost invariably at the bottom of the totem pole within the African community. You see this. And so, and that little community tends to be very low status compared to the rest of the community. And so this is the normal pattern of human behavior since the dawn of time. Why would anyone think that it's going to change? People have this tendency to think that because nothing's happened in their lifetime, that it's never going to happen. But typically, things happen on these 150-year cycles. So what does that mean? That means that usually there's several generations that never see this stuff. And I understand that there are some people who have this idea that everyone should look the same. I mean, I remember reading an Isaac Asimov novel. I'm trying to remember which one it was. But he talks specifically about how everyone has the same color brown skin and everybody's the same. And I remember even as a high school student reading that and thinking, even if everybody had exactly the same color skin, they would be fighting wars about blue eyes versus brown eyes, or white socks versus black socks. Humanity does not get along in large numbers very well. I think the only reason that we're getting along as well as we are, despite the extreme level of diversity that we now have in so many societies, is because everybody is drugged and entertained into near comatose status. It doesn't matter that your neighbors are fundamentally incompatible with you if neither of you ever goes outside and runs into each other. People talk about how living in the city, they don't even know their neighbors' names. I was kind of surprised the other day. I'm a suburban kid, so I'm used to the idea of knowing the people in your neighborhood, but that's it, right? So I was a little confused the other day, or a little taken aback the other day, when I went to run an errand out at a farm, and one of the farmers who used to be a teammate of mine several years ago, but he aged out and stopped playing, and he said, "So how's the knee?" I looked at him like, "What?" He said, "Oh yeah, I heard you hurt your knee at practice the other day." And it just made me laugh because my wife grew up in a small town. And of course she said, everybody knows everything about everyone. It's something you just have to realize. And I just don't think in those terms. And so it's interesting to see the difference between a small town, the suburb, and then of course in the city, people don't even know the names of the people who live across the hall from them in their apartment building. So, unrelated, but I'd love your thoughts on the Sultan wannabe Erdogan of Turkey. What are your thoughts on the survival of the nation of Turkey? I think that they've got pretty good prospects. They're pretty aggressive. I don't think that they're going to be giving up. I don't think Istanbul is going to turn back to Constantinople anytime real soon. So let's get to the super chats now. So, where are we? Oh, I'm on the comments, not on the super chats. That would explain the confusion. Okay. The Dashing Rogue says, Assange is an info broker. Nothing he says can be verified without people spilling the beans on top secret stuff. Do you think Assange is more chaotic? Well, I think that he is very chaotic. The question is he going to be used in the service of good order or evil order? We don't know. Craig Mason's Reasonable Conversation channel says, Trump said he would let Barr handle Assange, distance himself. Barr lets Assange go. Barr approves the image of the Department of Justice, who will bring treason charges. P.S. Can I interview you? I don't do interviews, sorry. But, that's one of the optimistic scenarios, I think. But we'll see. Justin says, Assange for Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, wouldn't that be a hilarious scenario? That all of this has taken place so that Donald Trump can appoint Julian Assange the Secretary of Homeland Security. I think that's probably the least likely scenario, but it would definitely be the most amusing one. Aaron Correa says conversation, which is to say that there are echoes on it. Wrestling Bear says, just arrived. What have I missed? We're just talking about Julian Assange, and I'm pointing out that none of us really knows anything about it. Fuad Muhammad says, have you read David Graeber's Debt, the First 500 Years? I have not read it, although I have read several reviews of it, and you're correct. It does debunk liberal notions on the origins of currency. However, all those ideas about the origins of currency were pretty obviously false anyhow, but definitely a useful thing to do. Defiance Bear says, if this all collapses as expected, how do you think the people that knowingly let it slip will act in the aftermath? Well, as far as we can tell, they seem to be planning to run off to New Zealand. So I think we're going to get a lot of it's not my fault, and we're going to get a lot of, well, you would have done the same thing if you were in my shoes, and we're going to get a lot of trying to rely on paying security guards to keep the evil people that they screwed over away from them. So Fox Wolf Bear says honk honk. Jordan B. Peterson mentions Carl Jung, spelled with a Y. Any thoughts on Jung? Yes, he was an occultist, a charlatan, and should be paid no regard whatsoever. Foxwolf Bear says, could Slavs and other whites be allies post-fall, or will it all come down to blood and peoples? There will be alliances. Here's the thing. There are always alliances of a practical nature. And one of the fascinating things about reading the history of the Crusades is that you clearly see the way that people are very practical about these things. At certain times, after the Crusader states were set up, you would have one Crusader kingdom allied with one Muslim emirate going to war against a Muslim emirate that was allied to a different Christian kingdom. So, the rules are not hard and fast. The lines are always blurred. But the important thing to understand is that the fact that the lines are blurry and get confused from time to time doesn't mean they don't exist or that they don't tend to play out in a certain pattern. So it's mostly going to come down to blood and religion and nations, but not entirely. But where the exceptions will be, we have no possible way of knowing. Christopher Gee says, hey Vox, missing your stream because I'm at some party somewhere with some people. Here's some bucks. Thanks, Christopher, and have a good time. The Studi says, have you heard about PewDiePie's exit from YouTube? Yes, I have, and actually it's inspired me to do some thinking about the question I asked you guys yesterday. So I think that that's a really great development. I have tremendous respect for PewDiePie doing that, and in the very unlikely event that he ever wishes to join unauthorized TV, we'd be delighted to have him. If so, your thoughts, please. I imagine them Shaq-fooing him hard now. I'm Vox Day, and the Studi is the smartest guy I know. That's funny. Well, the thing is, of course, they're going to pull all kinds of charades with him, but he's made it very clear that he doesn't care. He's done with them, and I think that every dominant corporation peaks at some time and then goes downhill, usually for reasons that are totally unnecessary. I mean, my first car was an Oldsmobile, a used Oldsmobile Cutlass. And there were so many Oldsmobiles around that it would have been impossible to imagine in the late 80s that Oldsmobile would be completely gone 30 years later. I mean, the company had been around for a lot longer than 30 years. Why would you think it was going to be gone? Because they missed the boat, first with the Japanese imports and then with the European imports. And then they missed the transition to sports utility vehicles. Now they're gone. YouTube is already on the downslope. They're just still so big and powerful that nobody recognizes it yet. Nobody realizes it yet. But the fact that somebody with 93 million subscribers would just walk away from it is a very significant nexus. Daniel says, what if all minorities in America had good character, were well-read, educated, and adopted American values similar to someone like Thomas Sowell? It wouldn't make much difference. Because they have different ways of living. They have different ways they like to live. What you're really asking is, what if all minorities in America were actually normal white Americans? Because that's the only way that would ever happen. I mean, the difference between Italy and Germany is so massive, so monstrous. Forget the difference between Greece and Scandinavia, which is even more extreme. Just Italy to Germany, it's not even that far. But the difference is so massive that if you've lived in both places, then you understand how totally insane the idea that, well, if everybody was just well-read and educated and had good character and adopted our values, then it would be okay. No, it wouldn't, because that can't happen. That's like saying, what if all the minorities in America had wings and, double D, the women had double D breasts and the men all had 18-inch penises and that, vibrated? Wouldn't life be better for everyone? Maybe, but it wouldn't matter because that's not the case. So why are you indulging in this fantasy, this impossible fantasy? Silver Hand Order said, I made mixed kids, and since listening to you, looking back to move to my original country, I can't take a chance my kids will be rejected in the U.S. That's probably wise. The general rule in non-white societies, in at least some non-white societies, but specifically Mexico and India, is that any admixture of white blood tends to be status increasing. It's really amazing when you look at the Mexican elite. They have these names that look like unpronounceable Aztec names, and they're like 6'3", blonde hair, blue-eyed people with maybe just a very slight element or two that makes you realize that there is some Hispanic heritage. That's why I always think it's so funny when people say to me, well, how can you be American Indian? You don't look American Indian to me. And like I point out frequently, have you noticed that nobody who knows me has ever called me out in any way, shape, or form on it? Think about how many people know who I am. How many people, went to school with me, knew me, went to church. I mean, my dad was all over the news when he was arrested and so forth. How come nobody has ever stepped forward to try to call me out about that? You know why? Because they know my family. If I ever put up a picture of me with my family, nobody would be doubting anything that I've said in that regard ever again. And that's why I think it's so ridiculous when people talk about this stuff, because it's so much more complicated than you might ever think. So let's get back to the super chats. Carolina Swamp Fox Bear said, my great-grandfather changed his name from Manteuffel. Can't figure out if he was escaping Hitler or a spy. Mom said he changed his name when he joined the American forces to avoid scrutiny. Strange. Yeah, that wasn't the reason, whatever it was. People change their names in order to fit in. That's why they change their names. Justin says, have $1. Thank you. Slamurai Jam Down. Random game dev question. If you could have a laptop that could support it, would you get a 15-inch 4K 60 hertz or 1440p 17-inch 144 hertz? Oh, I would always get the 17-inch. That's an easy question. And by the way, speaking of game dev, I looked at the trailer, watched the trailer. I am cautiously optimistic about Fantasy General 2. Cautiously. I like the idea that they've decided to get away from the rock, paper, scissors, but I'm nervous about them doing it correctly. And I'm totally envious that they're doing it. Hobby425 said, the emperor set you to plan the retaking of Constantinople for the Greeks. You have the other local Christian nations to help. How do you go about it? Well, first you need tactical nukes. There's no way you're going to, the numbers are so far against the Greeks. I mean, frankly, I'm shocked that they didn't completely lose Cyprus to the Turks. Christopher McCullough wants to know what side I am on in the coming sock war. Look at how I dress. Of course I'm on the black sock side. The studio says, forgive me if you've answered this many times. Please explain the idea and background behind the name Castalia and why it was chosen. Thank you. It's very simple. It's taken from Das Glasperlenspiel, or the Glass Bead Game, by Hermann Hesse. Hermann Hesse is one of my 3 favorite writers, and Castalia is the name of the imaginary nation in which the events of the Glass Bead Game and where the Glass Bead Game itself takes place. As a game designer and as a writer, that's one of my favorite books of all time. Pillar and Ground says, how does one who is having a child with a girl of South American descent retain identity and culture for himself and his kid and maintain a position of leadership in the face of her very dense and high volume extended family? I don't know. I mean, I guess what you would want, I guess what you would want to do, I mean, you've joined that family. you've joined that identity and culture. So if you're going to be there and be around them, I mean, every married couple from competing cultures or different cultures tends to join one of them. And so, you're either going to join her culture, in which case you should try to adopt her identity, or you need to avoid significant contact with them. I mean, one thing I think is interesting that I've noticed is that the couples that don't get pulled into one or the other is usually the result of moving away from both. In which case they tend to sort of lose their identity and culture altogether. So, I mean, that's the reality. That's what it is. Daniel says, thoughts on the late historian Edward Gibbon. I'm also looking for some good history books. Gibbon is obviously a landmark, but he's very, very biased against Christians, and his history is not entirely reliable. Historians that I enjoy reading particularly are Charles Oman, Stephen Runciman, and John Julius Norwich. Your thoughts on the burning of Alexandria's library and the Library of Congress. Do you wonder what we might know if they were not destroyed? Are there more significant book burnings that you know of? The burning of Alexandria's library is largely fictitious. There are a lot of lost works that we know references to. I don't think that we lost quite as much. I think that we actually know of a fair amount of what was lost, at least with regards to ancient history. I don't think that there was orders of magnitude more writings than we know of. Even if we don't have them, we often know of things by reference. And Justin says, have another $1. So thank you. Anyhow, that is all I have for tonight. I hope this has been useful, if not necessarily as on one side or the other as you might like. But we'll wait and see. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the next few weeks here with regards to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. There's only one way for us to find out, and that's wait and see. This is the Darkstream. Oh, and before I forget, make sure you check out Milo's How to Be Poor. It's on Amazon now. Only took him 10 days to review a 70-page book, but it's now available on Amazon. Check it out. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. This is the Darkstream. I'm Vox Day.